about 18 countries, including from the Pacific, with the objective of really helping to scale up climate finance, particularly domestic finance, mobilized finance, but really increasingly also with a much more private financing lens, and to really benefit from the power of the network, both technically as well as in terms of peer-to-peer sharing across the network of ministries of finance and other stakeholders. The Blue SME focus comes out of some joint work that was done with ADB and UNEP's Poverty Environment Action Initiative. And we're very pleased to have both Michael Adams and Joanne Fulton from the Ocean Assets Institute, since they were involved critically in doing that work, and now in helping us taking it further at the country level. Very pleased to have Mr. Ali from the Ministry of Economy from, I hope I have it right, Ministry of Economy of Fiji, as well as Vanil from UNDP to help set the stage with regard to efforts in the blue economy space. And then we'll come in with a presentation of the focus of this initiative, really with an aim to identify how to build that broader portfolio and add value in areas that the government sees fit, with this strong SME focus. A lot of work has been done in identifying sectors where the SMEs are in fact competitive. And now the focus really is on how do we bring that finance lens and investment lens and help to scale. So without further ado, let me turn over to Vanil Narayan from UNDP Pacific Country Office to set the stage from the UNDP country office perspective.
Thank you, Radhika, and Bulavanaka from Fiji, everyone. It's a rainy Tuesday afternoon here, but we really are very much honored to be able to present to you what we are doing here in Fiji, through the Fiji Country Office in collaboration with our Fijian government counterparts. One of the key things that the Fijian government has done over the past couple of years is really set the policy mandate and the policy stage for it to be operationalizing its blue economy ambitions. And I'm pleased to say that UNDP has responded adequately through the Fiji Country Office to help the Fijian government really operationalize its blue economy ambitions by transitioning those policies that has been implemented and actually operationalizing them through bankable, investable projects. And that is something that is very much a priority for the Fijian government that we at the country office have really been aware of and cognizant of. And so with regards to our blue economy country portfolio through the country office, we're working on a couple of things. The first, of course, is helping structure the Fijian government's upcoming sovereign blue bond issuance, which Mr. Ali will be talking about in further detail. But we're creating things like a common taxonomy for what constitutes as blue, green, and social, thematic projects, and that's something that is very important for us and for at least for the Pacific. And so the country office is working on that, and also helping to identify specific projects under the blue economy space that is actually bankable and ready to go, and being able to be funded by the blue bonds, and actually roping in the MSME sector as well. So that's a key thing that our colleagues from the Fijian government will be talking about a bit more. We are also running something called a Blue Accelerator Grant Scheme to be able to bring out really great and excellent transformative blue economy projects being done by the private sector, particularly the MSMEs. We have a colleague with us, Marita Manley, who will be talking to about that as well, very well. And also we're working with a couple of other MSME agencies and companies to establish things like Fiji's first ever organic fertilizer factory, and also to establish a sanitary landfill in the western division of Fiji that would be doing things like material recycling and so on and so forth, and also setting up a community-based special purpose entity that would be using coral reefs and its marine protected areas as revenue generating income for the community. So there's a lot of examples that we have been working on, and it'll be great to have our colleagues from the Fijian government and also our partners from the MSME space talking about this. So without further ado, I think I'll hand it over back to my colleagues in Bangkok who could move the agenda forward. So all the best, everyone, and thank you so much for joining in. Nakang.
Thanks, Vanil, and really pleased to hear those very concrete areas of work. And now, actually, let's hear from Mr. Ali from the Ministry of Economy. What are the Fiji government priorities? How do you see these coming together? And yes, particularly with regard to the Blue Bond as well, which is unique and really path-breaking in setting a focus, including a focus on SMEs. Over to you.
Thank you, Radhika, and Buluvinaka, everyone. Firstly, I'd just like to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak on how Fiji, along with our respective development partners, is working towards realizing a blue economy through the issuance of our Blue Bond and other respective activities, and the key role that MSMEs plays. I'm sorry, I have been going in and out of the meeting due to my unstable bandwidth, so I'll just be switching off my camera for a while, if that's okay with everyone. And just checking again if everyone can hear me well.
Yes, perfect. Yes.
Excellent, thank you. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So before going on to, or rather into the blue economy space in Fiji, perhaps a bit of insight for those who may not know about our tiny little country in the South Pacific. So quite often within the international arena, Fiji is often referred to as a small island developing state or a Pacific small island developing state. But something that has been quite often stated by our Honorable Prime Minister is we would much rather be referred to as a large ocean state. And especially due to the fact that Fiji has the 26th largest ocean space in the world, approximately 1.3 million square kilometers. Not too bad for a country with a population less than 1 million. We boast 3.52% of the global coral reef population. We have an overall coverage of 65,000 hectares of mangroves. So another potential area that the government is perhaps looking into a bit further down the line would be trading in carbon credits through blue carbon, but it's certainly a conversation for another day. Something to note, and which is quite common within the Pacific, is that over 70% of our population lives within 5 kilometers of the coastline, and furthermore live near one of Fiji's 45 rivers. This speaks, I believe, to the intrinsic relationship that we share with the ocean and how it has shaped the livelihoods, traditions, and cultures of the indigenous people of Fiji. We also have close to 466 locally managed marine areas spanning across the country. Something that we are quite proud of is that we have perhaps the most developed ports and the hydrological potential for renewable energy. And similarly in the tourism sector and inter-island linkages in the South Pacific. Perhaps this is why Fiji is often referred to as the hub of the South Pacific. Next slide, please. So the blue economy. Now, perhaps I should have stated this much earlier in my presentation, but my official title is the Ocean Officer. So my little sister often refers to me as Aquaman, but I believe that she's just teasing me. So the blue economy is something that has really befuddled even seasoned veterans within the economic space. What is the blue economy? It certainly can be confusing. One such definition that I heard, and this was their way of maybe streamlining the definition of blue economy, is that everything that touches the ocean is the blue economy. So certainly not streamlining it at all, I believe. But what we have tried to do is maybe demarcate it into broad sectors, but certainly not limiting it to these. Some of the sectors that we thought would be most suitable to the blue economy are sustainable fisheries through aquaculture and mariculture, marine protected areas, blue shipping and e-mobility, ocean-based renewable energy, and something that my colleague Vinil just referred to a while ago, sustainable waste management. Now, initially, I was a bit skeptical about why sustainable waste management can be related to the blue economy, but then it occurred to me, due to the fact that Fiji is a small island country, and that a lot of our citizens, our people are located within close proximity of the ocean, so is our infrastructure. We have solid waste landfills located close to river systems. When there is leachate, it goes into these rivers, and then by way of downstream effects, flows into the ocean system, causing detrimental cascading effects on coral reefs. And these are the same reefs that coastline communities rely on for their livelihoods. So you can already start imagining the types of difficulties and challenges that unsustainable waste management poses. And perhaps the most commonly used or commonly understood form of the blue economy is sustainable ecotourism. Next slide, please. Now, it is critical for a country to have a conducive legislative environment to help develop a healthy and resilient blue economy. Fiji has over 48 national regulations and policies related to the protection and conservation and sustainable use of our ocean. Key among these are the Offshore Fisheries Management Act. This allows the Minister of Fisheries to designate marine protected areas, which is quite critical to what the Fijian government is currently doing, and is a testament to its commitment to protect our marine spaces. We currently have a target of 30% of our EEZ designated as marine protected areas by 2030. Also, the Mining Act, which oversees the types of activities conducted in our ocean space. Point to note that Fiji currently has a 10-year moratorium on deep sea mining, but we do allow research and scientific expeditions within our waters. And lastly, or rather, the Environment Management Act. This provides the legislative support for the sustainable management of our natural resources. And well, I guess lastly now is perhaps the one that I'm most proud of is the Climate Change Act, which aims to establish a comprehensive response to climate change and provides the legislative backing to multiple climate change policies. This then informs the national ocean policy. The policy sets a clear mandate for accelerated development in line with SDG 14, Life Below Water, while also ensuring that the protection and conservation of our marine resources is maintained. Now, I must point out that the narrative of the National Ocean Policy is specifically on sustainability. However, it does articulate how we can, it does have indicators towards how we can facilitate and catalyze development. And this in some way, shape or form also informs how Fiji can develop a resilient blue economy. Next slide, please. So there's definitely a need for greater injection of funds to operationalize Fiji's blue economy ambitions. We first, or rather, one of the first types of bonds that we had issued was the Fiji sovereign green bonds, which was part of our 2017-2018 national budget, when we issued a bond worth US $50 million to finance projects that were sustainable, had environmental benefits, and simultaneously also address the most destructive impacts of climate change. In doing so, in issuing the green bond, Fiji became the first developing country and perhaps the first small island developing state to issue a sovereign green bond of US $50 million. Now, fast-track 5 years, we are now in line with the strategic direction that our leaders have dictated towards the restoration, conservation of our oceans. We are now on the verge of issuing our first sovereign blue bond. Now, the bond that the Fijian government seeks to issue is a multi-tranche bond. It would entail two particular tranches. The first, which will be issued in 2023, is a tranche worth US $10 million, followed by the second tranche, which is US $35 million in 2024, denominated in Fijian dollars. It is, as I understand, the highest ever domestic liquidity post-COVID-19. Next slide, please. So, and I apologize if the title is a bit cut off there, but these are the steps that the Fijian government, along with the UNDP, have developed towards the issuance of our blue bonds and how it will be framed. So the first step was the development of a broad framework which would define the parameters of a green, blue, or social bond that could be issued. There really isn't a need for a framework for each type of issuance to be created, as the parameters of each of these bonds would basically remain the same. Secondly, a feasibility study. Now, of the 4 projects, and this is something that I'll come to later on in the presentation. Now, so of the 4 projects that have been submitted to the Fijian government as part of the 2022-2023 national budget, a feasibility study has to be taken. Obviously, if there is a project or program, and that too with implications at the national level, it is critical that feasibility studies be undertaken to determine whether these are actually feasible. Will they work? And is it something that the government should really invest in? So these projects were submitted by the respective line ministries. Next is the front-facing document, or the prospectus. So once the blue bond projects are incorporated and officially announced in the national budget, as they have been, the blue bond prospectus will be developed with the respective feasibility studies attached as annexures, and then provided to potential investors to see that, yes, this is what Fiji is going to invest in. Should you be willing, you could invest here as well. Now, fourth, perhaps where the money, well, definitely where the money comes in, the issuance process. So domestic issuance in collaboration with the Reserve Bank of Fiji in the tranches, as I mentioned before, will be dependent on project readiness. There will be marketing and launch events that will be supported by the Blue Bond project funding from the UK government and with the support of the UNDP. And the necessary issuance documents will also be posted onto the websites of the Ministry of Economy and the Reserve Bank of Fiji. We are ensuring that this will be a very transparent and very inclusive process. And finally, how do you determine that a project or program that you have invested in is successful, definitely you will need a financial monitoring and impact reporting system in place. So to do that, a firm will be hired to develop real-time monitoring and simultaneously to develop reporting tools to help the Ministry of Economy and its implementing agencies keep track of how the 4 projects are working out. There is also the option of embedding human resource support for the Ministry of Economy to facilitate this work, and also provided to the Reserve Bank of Fiji should it need it. The Fijian Sustainable Bond Framework, ladies and gentlemen, has been developed in partnership with the UNDP, and it is due to be launched at COP27. So I do hope that many of you are there so that I can see you outside of the square of my laptop right now, and perhaps relish this important moment in Fiji's pathway towards the blue economy. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so now we go into the issuance of the first tranche. So these are the priority projects that have been submitted by the respective line ministries, and they will be covered within the first tranche in 2023, as I've mentioned before. So the first project, this is on nature-based solutions proposed by the Ministry of Waterways. Definitely a very critical area for the Fijian government. As I've mentioned, with more than 70% of our population living within 5 kilometers of the ocean, many of our communities are situated along the coastlines. And with the ever-present threat of cyclones, which will only continue to gain intensity, it is critical that we provide some sort of protection to these communities. It is very critical because while we are providing security for human lives, we are also providing security for human livelihoods. Inundation of coastlines causes detrimental effects on coral reef ecosystems. As I've mentioned before, a lot of these coastal communities rely on the coral reefs situated close to their villages for sustainable income. Secondly, sustainable fisheries. Aquaculture and mariculture is something that quite a lot of communities are interested in. This particular project will be supporting at least 7 fisheries businesses to scale across and to also scale up. And particularly, we will be targeting MSMEs here. And more so, we'll be giving more preference to women-led businesses. It's a point to note that there are more women within the informal fisheries sector than there are men. And it is something that the Fijian government is working tirelessly to ensure that these women are given the same opportunities that other people have into integrating into the more formalized market. Thirdly, and this is something that is still under consideration, it may or may not eventuate, but it definitely is something that is very interesting and has been earmarked as having a lot of potential, is the introduction of GPS tracking systems for inshore vessels. Now, the Ministry of Commerce, Trade, Tourism and Transport that actually submitted this project identifies vessels in a very basic way under 2 parameters. The first, whether they are above or rather more than 15 meters in length, and secondly, whether they are below or less than 15 meters in length. Vessels that are more than 15 meters are capable of going outside of Fiji's EEZ and fishing, whereas vessels below those vessels are fiberglass, small small vessels that belong to fisher folk that mostly fish within our territorial waters. Now, although larger vessels are required by law to have a GPS system so that the respective agencies can track them, smaller vessels have no such limitation. However, through this project in particular, fisherfolk have the option to go to a particular vendor and receive a GPS tracking system. The vendor will provide this to the person, to the respective person, but the cost will be burdened by the government. So the vendor will provide a receipt to the government, and the government will reimburse the vendor. I believe that the cost of the GPS system is around about 100. It is powered by, it is solar powered, so completely on renewable energy, and I believe the cost is around about 100 USD. Not too sure, and Vineil, do correct me if I'm wrong there, but
No, you're correct, Izan.
the cover is last in which is alluded to. So thank you, Vineil. So lastly, sustainable waste management, as Vineil had previously referred to. So this is to support the enhancement of waste treatment facilities for the Water Authority of Fiji. This particular project was proposed by the Ministry of Infrastructure. Key to note here that the current sewage treatment facility that we have in Suva is running at more than 150% of its capacity. And a lot of the infrastructure that it currently has is more than 20 to 30 years old. Definitely much older than I am. Although my wife does say that I look quite old. Well, bad jokes aside, some of the infrastructure that our sewage treatment facilities have can be dated back to when Fiji gained independence. So they are in dire need of getting in new infrastructure and resources to be able to cater to the growing demand for treatment facilities, particularly for sewage, which obviously is a huge issue in all countries. Thank you. Next slide, please. So tranche 2. This is the exciting part. Well, I won't say that tranche 2 isn't exciting. Definitely it is, but this is slightly more exciting because we get into more technical things here, such as blue shipping. This has been submitted by the Ministry of Commerce, Trade, Tourism and Transport. So blue shipping really is exciting to me as someone who focuses or works within the ocean space, because we're looking at getting in 2 hybrid electric or hydrogen vessels for the Fijian government shipping fleet. Now, the idea for this is that the government will initially be bringing these vessels into the country with the notion of running it, showing that there are feasible routes that are able to provide revenue and that there is low cost maintenance. And after a certain period, these vessels will be leased or sold to the private sector so that they can start running these vessels. And the general idea is that after a while, we would like to see a transition of all vessels within Fiji, large vessels within Fiji, to shift to this type of renewable energy based ships. Now, there are other questions involved with how can these be maintained and so on, but these are things that we are working closely with the Asian Development Bank as part of the feasibility study to better be able to address. Secondly, is sustainable fisheries. So much like in tranche 1, here the investments will be directed towards startups and of scale-ups of at least 4 aquaculture or mariculture projects, and looking at public-private partnerships or similar models. The feasibility study is currently being undertaken by the World Bank. Before I go on to the third project, I'd like to just skip on to the fourth one, because the third actually flows into the next slide. So on sustainable waste management, as I had alluded to before on leachates flowing into the river system and then into the oceans, for under sustainable waste management, the government looks at supporting the construction of a sanitary landfill and refuse transfer facility in the Western Division of Fiji. Currently, there is a landfill, but there are certain health risks and tagged to it, and it can definitely be made more sustainable, more ecologically and environmentally friendly, and definitely more friendly for human health as well. So this had been submitted by the Ministry of Local Government, and we have had quite a lot of interest, particularly from the Global Fund for Coral Reefs, on actually taking this on board as well. So we are looking at some sort of public-private partnership here as well. Now, onto the third one. Now, this is quite exciting. It's the Blue Investment Fund, which will be a commercial lending facility seed funded by the Fijian government through the Blue Bond issuance. Now, perhaps before I start explaining it and confuse you and myself, maybe we can go on to the next slide so that I can illustrate it better and explain. Thank you. I do hope that makes sense, because it sometimes confuses me as well, but I'll try to explain it to you to the best of my ability. So, the Blue Investment Fund, particularly in essence, looks at, for example, if a person were to have a project that they have, which in some way, shape, or form contributes to the facilitation of the blue economy. Let's say they would take it to any commercial banks such as Westpac, BSP, ANZ. But if they were to take their proposal there, those banks would straight up decline, because these are not the conventional forms of activities that they provide loans for. If that particular person were to have gone there and asked for a home loan, or perhaps to buy a car, or to go to Southeast Asia for a vacation, maybe that could have been something that they could have looked at. But what these commercial banks will tell that respective person is to go to the Fiji Development Bank. Now, the FDB is inundated with similar proposals. So to avoid disgruntled potential entrepreneurs within the blue economy space, and particularly to ensure that MSMEs have the opportunity to access funding, what the Blue Investment Fund does is that, maybe I'll start from the far left, is that projects are selected by the Blue Accelerator grant scheme, as Vinil had previously alluded to. So these are a whole list of projects that anyone in Fiji can send in a proposal for. These projects are then tailored in partnership with the Fijian government and the UNDP and the private sector partners to strengthen its business case. Let's say if I were to come with a proposal for within aquaculture for a fish farm, particular fish farm, but my proposal may be lacking certain technicalities. That is where the Fijian government, in partnership with the private sector and the UNDP, would tailor make it, add that additional information to strengthen my business case. Then it would go for impact financing. Maybe maybe a pilot could be run for my aquaculture farm, or a scale phase with established impact indicators, building investment readiness for my project. This entire period would last anywhere in between 6 to 18 months, with a dedicated funding available to assist the process of around 50 to 150 thousand US dollars. And Vinil, please correct me if I'm wrong there, but that is the incubation period of sorts that is available. Now, after that is done, a robust pipeline of blue economy projects that have strong development potential and ability to attract additional financing will be developed. And then, as you've seen, these will be projects 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so on. Now, after this robust pipeline has been developed, the successful investment-ready projects are then capable of handling debt financing. So then my project, after it has gone through this entire process of making it more investor-friendly and strengthening its business case, then I would be able to go to the Blue Investment Fund. Now, let me track back a little bit. Now, as I said before, the Fiji Development Bank is inundated with a lot of proposals. So how can we ease the burden on the FDB? Well, it's simple. Provide a mechanism whereby they can provide financing to the existing commercial banks within Fiji to provide potential entrepreneurs like me who would want to go and invest in aquaculture financing that the FDB does not have the time to. So I can then go into Westpac and get financing for my aquaculture farm, provided that it facilitates or is linked to the blue economy. I'm sorry, I'm just going to pause there real quick and just ask if everyone is on board. I'm sorry, I hope that I'm able to explain it well.
Thanks, Mr. Izhar Ali. Are there any questions at this point, or any requests for clarifications? I think we're all keeping our videos off, given bandwidth issues to the extent possible. Yeah. So please raise your hand, your virtual hand, if there are any issues. Otherwise, we'll revert back to this later. Thank you.
Great. Well, I see that Joanne is quite clear. Maybe I should start. Maybe I should have pursued my dream of being a lecturer. I think I'm doing quite a good job right now. But well, I'm glad that everyone is able to understand my messy explanation of how this would look like. But going back to what I was saying is that the FDB is inundated. It cannot look at my proposal because it has tons of proposals there. It is shifting that burden onto the existing commercial banks in Fiji so that any MSME can go to any bank within the country and access financing. What helps those MSMEs in accessing that financing at a lowered interest rate is the BAGs, the Blue Accelerator Grant Window, because it makes my proposal much more attractive, and it has a good business case with good impact financing via the pilot, via the scale phase, and a good, basically a very good business case. Now, what would also help, and if you see right at the bottom on your right-hand side, is that the UNCDF is also providing de-risking of first loss finance. So if, and God willing, my aquaculture farm does not pan out as I want it to, and I'm not able to pay back the loan that I had taken from the Blue Investment Fund via the commercial lending facility, the UNCDF is available to pay my default. So Vinil, I hope your wallet is open with a whole lot of money, because in case I do default and leave the country. But yes, that in a very, very, very large nutshell is how the Blue Investment Fund will work. Thank you. Could we go on to the next slide, please? So this is basically a snapshot of the number of applicants that we had received thus far and those that had been shortlisted. So in total, we had received 29 applications, and the total value of these applications were $8.2 million. Now, of the 29, 10 have been successful, with another 4 in reserve and still seeking funding. Of the successful applicants, the total value of these projects are worth close to $4.7 million. Now, right at the bottom, you'll see how these projects are split between the 4 priority areas. So we've got 2 projects under aquaculture and mariculture, 2 under marine conservation and protection, 3 under blue shipping and e-mobility, and 3 projects under sustainable and ecotourism. And just above that, you'll see the leverage of successful Blue Accelerator grant scheme applicants. Quite a nifty abbreviation we have, BAGS. But yes, you'll see that under the BAGS grant, aquaculture and mariculture, for example, BAGS is providing $200,000, whereas more than 2 million is provided by co-funding. Under blue shipping, you'll see that $320,000 only is being provided by BAGS, whereas 890,000 is provided by co-funding. So it just shows that the applicants are willing and prepared to put forth their own money via co-financing, but they just need that extra support by the Fijian government to be able to round it off. And that is what we are trying to facilitate. We are trying to assist MSMEs in realizing their ambitions and simultaneously realizing the ambitions of the Fijian government in achieving a blue economy. Next slide. Wow, thank you. I lost track that I came to the end of my presentation. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I do hope that I was able to provide you with a glimpse of what Fiji is doing via blue bond issuance and just how critical MSMEs are to the work that we are doing in realizing our blue economy ambitions. Please, if there are any questions, feel free to raise your hand. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Izhar Ali. I don't see any hands up, so in the interest of time, perhaps we can move to the next segment and then pick these questions up. I hope you will be here with us for a while during the webinar, right?
Yes, Ms. Lau.
Okay, thank you. So now, actually, this is a perfect segue to bring in Michael and Joanne from the Blue Impact Ocean and the Ocean Assets Institute to give their presentation more from the side of the SMEs and to explore how Blue Impact can sort of synergize with this work underway by the Fiji government. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Radhika, and especially Minister Izhar Ali. That was an excellent presentation, and I see there's no need to emphasize the importance of MSMEs in the blue economy or in all of the wider economy in general, and that's our task with our new Blue Impact Initiative, which was born out of the Blue Economy Knowledge Product. I'll give you a quick overview if you want to go to the next slide. This was a project that was funded and supported by a consortium of ADB, the UN Development Program and the UN Environment Program. And we worked for almost 2 years on this, compiling a lot of data and case studies and recommendations to be helpful to the various stakeholders in order to drive more capital to a more sustainable blue economy across 29 developing member nations that touch on the ocean under ADB's authority. So to the next slide, I should mention that our group is a nonprofit research and advisory group focused entirely on blue economy issues. Later on, we're going to hear from my colleague, Gregor Patterson-Jones, who was with me on the team that established Blue Invest Europe, which is somewhat of a model for what we're doing on our Blue Impact Initiative. But on the Blue Economy Knowledge product, it had 5 sections, and you see them there. One was identifying opportunities across 16 different sectors, or 18, depending on how you count. Section 2 was about compiling the various metrics that are used. Section 3, quantifying the gap of financing in each of the sectors and in each of the countries. And that was a lot of primary research. Section 4 was finding out who are the investors and what do they need and what are they doing currently. And Section 5, we pulled it all together with recommendations that included what we're doing right now, that indeed, as the minister has said, the MSMEs are of critical importance and they are the ones most lacking in access to capital. But we also did work on infrastructure and other categories as well. So yes, please, the next slide. On section 1, just to give you a quick snapshot, there are the 16 market segments under that column there in the middle. And you could, we framed them by these 3 focus areas, and you see their objectives there. But over to Fiji scored quite high, highest among all the Pacific countries. And this was against 8 different criteria on ranging from investor appetite and risk and opportunity defined in various ways. And the maximum score was 36, which no countries got, I think, but got close with some of the larger countries that had more capacity. That's the only major difference between Fiji and the ones who scored higher. So that was a good overview of the blue economy in all the countries there, and you get to see where you stand. By the way, this report and the final report, which condensed our findings, is available on the ADB site. There was a link on the previous slide, I think, to that report on blue economy finance. Move to the next slide, please. In section 2, we look at the metrics, and it depends on what you need, which sector you're looking at, and who's the stakeholder, because we compiled all the standards and metrics used by finance, industry, science, as well as policy makers. And each one of those has a very different agenda. So for it's not just seafood, but we looked within seafood at aquaculture, fishing, seafood processing, even algae. And all the micro segments have their own standards and case studies as well. So it's quite a useful guide. And the takeaway, as we mentioned there, is to try to begin with the end in mind, that you're going to have to meet those standards. So going on to the next slide. The section 3 was where we determined what are the actual financing gaps. In other words, by how much money is needed to achieve the SDG goals by 2030. So that's what we defined as the end game, minus the ongoing investments that we're able to track. And there you have the gap for each sector and each country. So the total we got for the region, and these are the low numbers, because various different assumptions give you different conclusions. The low number for the region was 5.5 trillion. For the Pacific Island region, 1.1 trillion. Just as a point of comparison, I think it was 2.4 for Southeast Asia. For Fiji, 50 billion was our low estimate on what is needed to achieve sustainability across all the blue sectors. And again, as mentioned in the previous presentation, things that are typically thought of as on land, not in the ocean, like waste management and sustainable infrastructure. Those are all included there too. So it provides a useful guide in that the data was very granular, and we looked at different assumptions for each of the different sectors and how to get to more sustainable practices by 2030. In any case, it's a big number. There are a lot of T's and big B numbers there, and you're competing against a lot of other countries for investment capital, particularly private capital, which is what we're focused on the Blue Impact Initiative. In section 4, if you want to skip ahead to the next slide, we looked at how to create a guide to capital market resources. And this was divided into two sections with financial investors and corporate investors. They're both important and they're very different. And so this survey, we looked at what the needs are and the opportunities and challenges, and developed a guide with current surveys on who's doing what and which financial mechanisms are being used. It's an excellent plan what Fiji is doing between the Blue Bond and the Blue Investment Fund and the Accelerator Grant Scheme. And that mirrors what some other countries are doing, but it's certainly Fiji is on the cutting edge of what's possible and what needs to be done to attract more private capital. On the next slide, I think we've got a little snapshot of the region, the broader region. Now, we don't have a picture just of Fiji because these were based on surveys compiled of private investors worldwide, and they're very bullish on Asia Pacific and particularly on Southeast Asia. In this grouping, you have India and China as well. But the reason I put this in as the bigger picture, it is a reference for Fiji. Most investors are not going to have a Fiji plan. They'll look at the region and look at the most competitive opportunities, as well as the country's governance and enabling conditions. My colleague Dominique Benziken will tell us more about that in a minute. And the outlook, and this was coming out of COVID, was quite good for private equity and private debt in particular, which are the ones that we're working on most of all. The infrastructure bar, the reason that that's important, and that high red bar for Southeast Asia, is that while the needs are great, the appetite is also equally keen. And so the other blue sectors generally will participate in that because that's in its own way an enabling condition, a precondition for growth across the blue economy sectors and things like the ports and the waste management needs that were mentioned earlier. So there is a rising tide. Of course, this is also heavily influenced by China's Belt and Road Initiative. And that is something that attracts major capital from around the world. But is it getting to the MSMEs? Now, that is, again, the problem that we come back to in our initiative and Fiji's in the Blue Investment Fund. In the next slide, can we see that? Yeah, this is just a quick breakdown snapshot. I think my colleague Greg Patterson-Jones will give us a little more detail on this as well. But it's important to remember that every investor type is different, and they have different needs and different constraints. They are almost all fiduciaries, so they can't do what they may want to do personally in any case. And those constraints take the form of different vehicles that they are allowed to or authorized to use. And some of the ones there, from the green bonds to different funds and project financing and direct deals, are listed there, and very different time horizons. So it's important that you, as I mentioned earlier, begin with the end in mind. Projects, as well as policymakers, begin with the goal in mind, which usually is to attract private capital. I mean, we know that 90% of the capital needed to fund all the SDGs needs to come from private capital markets. So that is the end in mind, and here are some of the needs and capabilities of the different kinds of private investors. On the next slide, you'll see some of the different vehicles. Could we switch to the next slide, please, Janu? You'll see some of the different vehicles. This is not so easy to read, I apologize, but obviously corporate financing and working capital loans are the tall bars there. But this was taken from, I guess, is it not visible? The footnote's important on this one. Okay, this was taken from the Principles of Blue Economy Finance, which is hosted by UNEP, UN Environment Program Finance Initiative, and we wrote the chapters on ports and shipping guidance for financiers, actually. So I do recommend looking at that under the UNEP website, that you'll find the principles of sustainable blue economy finance. And the ones that this was a snapshot of what's being used in all the blue economy sectors, all the different instruments that are being used, and they're not mutually exclusive. You can have many of these operating at the same time, as we see in Fiji, of course. But it's important to recognize the range that's capable there. One in the middle, I want to mention insurance, because of the coastal resilience problems or issues, let's say, is being integrated into many of these packages, and it's extremely important that it does so. One instrument that you don't specifically have here are grants, and they play a critical role, as is anticipated with your own Blue Investment Fund. But that gives you an idea of the range of financial vehicles out there. Next slide, please. So this also is an important source that you can note, the Blue Economy Finance Handbook. I hope you can see that whole reference point. The Blue Economy Finance Handbook came out 2 years ago, and this picture, also it's more clear in the handbook, shows the range of investment vehicles, from debt and equity tools to, in the first 2 rows there, the grant and corporate social responsibility investment, and how they match up against all the different blue sectors. So looking for the bright green boxes there to where they're most commonly used, where it's an appropriate mix. And we did this as well in our Blue Economy Knowledge product. I like this picture better, but we did a very good investor matching exercise that shows a little more detail, in fact, than this. But it's important that, again, that you think when you attracting private capital, that you have the right investment vehicle for your particular sector. And so that's a useful graph to see. I think we just have one more slide, and I am moving quickly because of consciousness of the other speakers to come. And so we concluded with a similar conclusion that we reached when we helped set up the Blue Invest Europe program, which has been a strong success, with mobilizing over 300 million of euros in new capital towards the blue economy in Europe and towards SMEs. And so the similar conclusion is that the SMEs are the key driving, over 90% of economic activity in many of the countries that we're talking about, and over 70% of employment. And so how can we drive more capital to them? That was the system that we are working on now, is Blue Impact, which is very complementary to Fiji's Blue Investment Fund and Blue Bond, and uses some catalytic capital from ADB, as well as the resources of UNDP and UNEP, to both identify projects and to give them the technical support on the ground. So we're here for you to answer questions as we go along, and to work with you closely in the future. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Michael, for that, again, comprehensive presentation. Just checking if there are any quick clarification points, issues that you would like to bring up. I see there have been some discussion in the chat. But just seeing, if there is any quick points. Otherwise, we turn to hear from some of the SMEs. And here I would turn, let me just check on the message.
There is one question from Marita Manley.
Yeah, please come and join. Yeah, Marita.
She asked, very interested to know whether the enabling environment for doing business and investment were considered as part of the opportunities identification.
Yes, they were among the 8 criteria that we used to evaluate each of the blue sectors in each of the countries. Indeed.
Yeah, and I also see a comment by Sasha Weiss of Bankers Without Boundaries on not to forget the blue Bonds to Finance Sustainable Blue Economy Practitioners Guide, which has been mentioned here as well. And the guidance will be published during COP27. Okay, so should I turn over to you, Joanne, to sort of curate the next segment?
Sure. In fact, Dominique will talk now about the enabling environment, because it's a more macro perspective. And then I will talk about the Blue Impact Program and the SME development exercise. And then Greg Patterson-Jones will talk from an investor point of view. If we have a time issue, I may switch with him. That's all.
Thank you very much, Joan and Radhika. For the sake of time, because we have quite a bit of other presentation to go, I will try to go through the few slides that I have reasonably quickly. The main focus of what I want to talk about, which is really relevant to this webinar, is about the enabling environment for SME investment. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. I'll just very briefly mention the Seychelles Blue Economy case study, just to reinforce the fact that it's one of the very important aspects of investment is to have a really a solid policy framework to work from. And the Fiji presentation that we had earlier does that in a very good way. And it was only to make that point to look at the Seychelles, which developed a blue economy in 2018. And you can see in there the key priorities. Two of them are really related directly to the SMEs. One is creating wealth and the other one is sharing priorities. So one is very much to facilitate private sector, small scale private sector, local development. And the sharing prosperity relates to the fact that there is some level of equity between companies and local SMEs. The priority number 3 is about the environment, which is not very different from what Fiji is doing, securing a healthy, resilient and productive ocean. And priority 4, which is really a critical one, and it's strengthening the enabling environment. And that includes a few things like whole of government oversight and stakeholder engagement, integrated marine planning and maritime security, research and innovation for development, financing, which is what we're talking about here today. And it includes both domestic revenue, but also private investment. As Michael was saying, most of the investment in blue economy will come from private capital. And finally, regional and international advocacy and partnership. Next slide, please. Very briefly, thank you. Very briefly, looking at implementation and the different roles that the private and the public sector play in blue economy implementation. Starting with the private sector, as we said before, SME dominate local blue economy. There are, however, quite a number of large partners that are industry partners in the blue economy. And some of the issues that are important to raise is the issue of making sure that local SMEs have a reasonable access to ocean resources, and in the same way as larger sort of industry partners. There's something here about weak governance and corruption. These are governance issues that actually facilitate a less transparent sort of sector use. The private sector is also an investor, and that's been mentioned before, either through innovative finance or impact investment. And the private sector and the private capital is really interested in all aspects of blue economy. And they have actually developed, the financial sector has developed their own metrics, if you like, for sustainability. industry standards and a number of activities. And so this is quite important. And the private sector, as a major investor in blue economy, is keen to align with SDGs, climate net zero by 2050, and also had certification mechanisms in place. So a self-regulating sort of aspect of the private sector for those investors that are interested in sustainable blue economy. Now, on the side of the public sector, this is where the role of the enabling environment comes in very strongly, and it refers to both the legal and policy framework. I mentioned earlier the Seychelles Blue Economy Policy, and Fiji also has an ocean policy, which is very clear in terms of what are their strategies and the key priorities. And there's also all the legislation that actually regulate activities in the ocean space. And I mentioned the ease of doing business, which is very, very important for private investors wanting to work in the blue economy space, because these are very practical aspects of setting up a business in any country. And as you might be aware of, the World Bank actually ranks countries for their ability to provide a good environment for doing business. So I don't have the ranking for Fiji, but these include things like, and I'll read from the book here from the World Bank side, starting a business, dealing with construction permits, getting electricity. So a very broad range of things, getting credit, these sorts of things, very practical things. The public sector also, the government, sets out the environment, social safeguards and standards, and is actually ensuring compliance and enforcement. The other point, which relates very, very clearly to financing, and Michael mentioned some of that, is the public sector is also an investor, and primarily in public goods and services like marine conservation, policy development, pretty much a lot of the readiness finance that is needed for private sector investment. And that's what they call de-risking private sector investment, and also blended finance. So as mentioned by Michael, there's quite a range of investors that have an interest in different aspects of blue economy, and the public sector is there to help get over the hurdle of getting project ready, so that private sector find that they get a return on their investment. Next slide, please. Now, this is pretty much a summary of what are the important aspects of enabling SMEs in blue economy, and I've got four areas there. The first one is to have in place the blue economy policy, which actually defines the overarching strategic priority and the sustainability, equity, and resilience principle, as well as the investment strategy that will be guiding investment, public and private. The second one is the regulatory framework. As I mentioned earlier, it's all the legislation that regulates activities, but also access right for particular ocean resources, ease of doing business, compliance, and accountability. So those two aspects, the policy setting and the regulatory framework, are important aspects of good governance. And good governance provide actually certainty and for investors, and they're more confident to invest in countries that have got very good policy and regulatory frameworks. The other side of this, oops, sorry, I've lost it. Oh yeah, the other side is capacity and finance. And this is more how to actually support SMEs in developing project proposals that will have a good business case. And in many cases, those projects, those proposals are not fit for purpose. And this is where the educating and the training is necessary, particularly in the business training. But the other thing too is to ensure that there is access to finance for those projects. One of the issues that small projects have is the issue of scale. And this is where accelerators and platforms such as the Blue Impact become really important, because you can actually bring projects to market in a way that actually will attract investors. The last point that I have here is educating local financiers, and I'm not quite sure, and that's a question that might be of interest for the Fiji government, but how local banks actually are familiar with assessing proposals from SMEs in sustainability. They might have the capacity to assess the financial side of those proposals, but not necessarily the sustainability aspect of it, and that might require additional training. And the last one is voice and equity, which is essentially an important aspect of good governance, and it's ensuring that you have a voice in decision making. In the case of SMEs, because they're usually small projects, they often need economy of scale. They need to actually work ways to work together to have a voice in decision making that actually impact on them, and ensure that there is a level playing field in accessing finance and resources, technical resources as well. And I think I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dominique. In the sake of time, we have switched presentations. We are going to ask that Greg Patterson Johnson present now, because he has a board meeting and has to leave at 45 after the hour. And I will present the Blue Impact and the role, the niche that we're trying to fill within the SME space for financing. So Tanu, if you can put up the slides for Greg, he will come on and do his presentations, because this is all about getting private capital, and Greg is here to talk about the investor's perspective, and it is a critical part and really the end game of this exercise. So Greg, it's over to you now.
Well, thank you, everybody. And for those in Asia, good afternoon, good evening, and in Europe, good morning. I'm going to talk very, very briefly. And my presentation, albeit brief, is going to be very practical, in the sense that it's going to be talking about the real practical implications of creating an investment vehicle that can attract in private finance, and how you use the instruments and the structure and the implementation of the vehicle to make sure that you address the challenges that SMEs have. And this particular presentation, which will be very short, will focus on learnings that I have personally had through involvement with funding structures in Fiji, predominantly two of them, which are the Joint SDG Fund, Global Coral Reef Fund, the Blue Impact Fund, which is focused on investing in the blue economy specific projects, and also the wider blue economy in Fiji, but also the involvement in a portion of the allocation of funds which will be flowing through the FDB, the Fiji Development Bank, for funding of blue economy SMEs in Fiji, and the challenges that one has. On top of that, also just bringing in some information from other investment structures that our consultancy has been involved in. EMIF is one of them, which is funded by DFAT, and a couple of other projects that we've looked at elsewhere in the Pacific Islands. Thank you. Next slide. So you might have had this presented to you. Most of the people on the call are very aware of these projects, but just as a short reminder, the Investing in Coral Reefs and Blue Economy project, which is a joint SDG project. In other words, it has a number of UN agencies which are investing and spending time developing it. And those are UNDP, UNCDF, and UNEP. And this is a facility to crowd in private sector capital into the blue economy in Fiji. And it's focusing on developing investments and an investment pipeline, which will have a net benefit to the coral reefs. So that it'll either be mitigating deleterious effects of other activities on the coral reefs, or it will be promoting the growth of the coral reefs. So, for example, one of the projects in this particular portfolio is looking at improving the waste management and creating a waste management program and improved landfill so that you don't have the same amount of leaching into the reef, which is killing the reef in a certain part of Fiji. It obviously has a number of partners, which is the Global Fund for Coral Reefs, the Joint SDG Fund, providing largely concessional and some investment money, but also some local players for project development, Matanataki, and then some international players at a later stage, which will be responsible for the international finance. The sovereign blue bond, I won't go into in much detail. You're all aware of that particular project. Effectively, what these projects are doing is finding ways of blending finance, so using public sector resources in the best way so that they can crowd in private sector finance by reducing the risks of investing and making the investment ready for the private sector. And the private sector here is a combination which depends on the type of business being funded. So when it's a larger project, one is hoping to crowd in the DFIs, the MDBs, and commercial project finance banks. When it is the smaller projects, local commercial banks, and in some cases where there's equity investor, international funds, and so forth. So next slide. So after that rather lengthy introduction, this is really what I had to tell you. And these are just practical tips and thoughts inside my head, which are learnings from working in Fiji. The first thing is, what is an SME? How do you look at Fiji as an economy, and how do you apply funds? So often when I have conversations about the Pacific, people are talking about the same size of funds that they might apply to a country which might be at the similar stage of development, but is a much bigger economy or has a much larger population. So you're talking about countries like Nigeria or Ethiopia or Uganda in Africa. Now, Ethiopia has 100 times the population of Fiji. It's not appropriate to assume that you can apply the same level of finance or the same level of funds to an economy like Fiji. The other thing is that, what is the definition of an SME? You can't apply the same definition of an SME in Europe, for example, to an SME in Fiji. For example, SME in Europe can be anywhere up to 250 employees, anywhere up to 50 million euros of annual turnover, a balance sheet, which has assets of up to 43 million euros. Now, there are very few businesses in Fiji which you would think are in fact SMEs, when you're thinking about Fiji SMEs, which would fit into that higher level of the definition. So what you're really talking, when you're talking about SMEs in Fiji, is actually small and micro businesses with the odd project, which is slightly larger. So that's very, very important. And you've got to make the financial solutions appropriate to those sorts of businesses that you are targeting. So what are the problems with access to finance? Generally, to get commercial finance from the local banks, they don't have a problem with liquidity. Generally, the local banks, it's more to do with the risk. So local businesses generally don't have collateral. They often don't have a level of financial readiness, the right set of accounts, the right disciplines in the business, or the right reporting, or even familiarity with borrowing. They often have an uncertain cash flow profile. For example, if it's a seasonal tourist business, it's not something that can serve as cash flow on a monthly basis. And there's often a lack of equity for the businesses. So often banks won't want to lend against a business which doesn't have enough equity in it or doesn't have enough cushion. And there is also then within the local institutions a lack of risk-taking capital. So banks largely want to lend and have the risks, the risks of non-payment somehow diluted by the fact that they can hold some collateral. Now, often the holding of collateral is actually not that effective, because in the Pacific Islands, to perfect collateral, to perfect security at least, and to exercise that security to go to court, let's say, to take ownership of land, can take years. So the banks usually do it just to enforce discipline on the borrowers, but that collateral often doesn't exist. So very, very briefly, what are the types of solutions that can meet the requirements of SMEs but also use the smallest amount of money possible from public sector sources so that you can crowd in private sector finance. The first thing is to size the solutions appropriate to what the pipeline is. And at the same time, you then need to work on developing the pipeline. So for example, in the Blue Impact project, a lot of money is being spent on making sure that the pipeline is investment ready. So the disciplines are there, it's advanced enough, the equity has been raised so that banks can lend to the businesses, but also so that these businesses can have some reduced risk. So the first and probably the most important instrument that you can use when there's a portfolio of businesses to support is some sort of guarantee that will mitigate the necessity for collateral that the banks are requiring. And this is an instrument that is increasingly becoming important all over the world, has been very successful in Europe, has had some success with some of the the multilateral development banks and donor agencies like CEDA, putting out a number of portfolio guarantees. But those guarantees are in most parts in an economy like Fiji to replace the collateral that would normally be needed. And the banks then can reduce the requirement for collateral because the collateral that they're taking under a guarantee is certain. It's not like an asset like a motorbike or a piece of land or a shed, something like that, a small piece of collateral that has value, but the market value is not really established. It might take some time to sell and so forth. So this allows the banks then to have a lower level of collateral and make it easier for them to lend. The second thing, especially when you're looking at the slightly larger projects, is where a project needs time, like a waste project, which is subject to people paying for a particular service. You need to build up that service over time, and you need to have some certainty of cash flow. Now, that doesn't happen immediately. When you're building up a service, especially a public service, which is funded through fees, which are paid by retail individuals or small businesses, that takes a few years. So what you need there is where the banks want some certainty of repayment, don't want to offer a grace period and want short tenors, you need to have some subordinated money in the structure that has a longer grace period, a much longer tenor, takes the cash flow and debt servicing pressure off the business, and allows then the banks to lend with more certainty. Now, as far as equity is concerned, what we've done elsewhere in some of our projects, specifically in the energy sector, is where businesses don't want to give up equity because the value of the businesses is not very high at the early stages, and people are putting a lot of effort and money into their businesses, don't want to lose an enormous amount of equity. So there are instruments, some of them which were tested in the States in the early stages of the VC market, and others which are now quite normal in the Southeast Asian market, largely are types of convertibles. So they are where the public sector is offering some debt in the case that there is an event, which is a revaluation event, or there's something that perhaps goes wrong with the business that can convert to equity. But that's not the intention. The intention then is to provide risk capital which gets an appropriate return, which doesn't dilute the entrepreneur. Last two things which are very important, and I think everyone is familiar because they're all involved in actually exercising this work, and that is technical assistance for financial readiness. Now, that is technical assistance by making sure the businesses are set up to run their accounts correctly, set up on their debtors and creditors, but it's also some of the financial disciplines that are associated with making sure that you invoice on time, making sure that you receive cash on time, that you're managing that side of the business, not only just reporting it correctly. The other thing is to make sure then that you have enough local capability to do accounts, because banks will continue, because they have certain requirements from a credit risk point of view, to have audited accounts. Then lastly, some things that have been developing in the market elsewhere, and there's been some movement in Fiji, is looking at other ways of underwriting. So in other markets, you've started to see non-banking financial institutions and non-typical microfinance institutions underwrite, and these are fintech companies, underwrite on a slightly different basis. So being able to use other information which is not typical financial information to determine what the likelihood of an individual owning a business or a small business itself is to repay. And there's some very, very sophisticated pieces of software now that look at social media activity, for example, the number of friends you've got on Facebook, how often you message, who you message, what level of small transaction activity you have on your personal and your business account. All of those have started to become useful for developing credit underwriting models. And those for the very, very small SMEs for lending, which is outside of the banking sector, have become useful tools. And those, again, can be applied to different markets. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm available for the next 5 or 10 minutes for questions. Thank you, everybody. Over and out from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. Very important to hear what the instruments are, where the market is going, and what the people with the money are looking for. Clearly, they want their money back. The question is at what rate and over what time. So your input has been extremely valuable. Because Greg has to leave for a board meeting, I think it is better to take questions specifically related to his presentation now. I do see a question from Marita, well, not a question, but a comment. But Marita, would you like to ask a specific question or clarify anything from a Fiji point of view?
Thanks so much for the presentation. Really useful, and completely agree with many of the points that were raised. I guess one of the challenges that most SMEs in Fiji face is all of the things you've listed in terms of understanding how to raise capital for scale. That's the majority of SMEs, don't scale because there are not easily available loan offerings or other offerings that enable them to do that. So I was just wondering if you'd come across any good examples of SMEs in Fiji that have successfully scaled through equity investments.
So I'm sure there are examples. Unfortunately, I haven't been involved in the Fiji market for long enough to go through the lifetime of these. There are some earlier stage investments that we expect to scale. One of them is a fertilizer manufacturer using organic fertilizer, which is part of the Blue Impact package. So I don't have a clear answer there. What I can say in scaling, the access to finance is one component of scale, but when you work in a market which is relatively disaggregated geographically, also a small market, scale is not just to do with finance, it's also to do with the ability to create a product which can be sold, exported, whether a service or a product, elsewhere outside of the home market. So this is very, very important for Fiji. Fiji is limited by the size and its geography. So when you're dealing with SMEs that grow, you have to look at those SMEs which have some service or product which can extend outside of the island, elsewhere in the Pacific, or even to the close by markets which are a little bit bigger, like New Zealand and Australia. And this is probably one of the factors that a lot of entrepreneurs in Fiji don't immediately think about, because you focused on just making a business work in your own home market, but the home market is limited. And that's why, I mean, globally, you see most of the unicorns come from very, very large economies, China, US, because you can extend in your own market with the same set of regulations without too much trouble. So yeah, that's my sort of parting shot.
Okay, thank you very much, Greg. Another question, comment, Mr. Ali, from your perspective, anything, your presentations are very integrated, that's clear. Well, I think what's important here is that in the cross-regional learning, or global, what we call in academia, worldwide learning, is very important, because the more we share experiences across, the more time we save in actually achieving impact. So your perspective, Greg, is really, really valuable, because you have your hand on the pulse of the the market, and that is what is driving our activity. Anybody else would like to ask a question before we move on to a next presentation? Take advantage. It's not often we can capture Greg or any investor, and Greg has specific knowledge of Fiji, so it's quite a great combination. I think people are listening and absorbing so much information at once. So unless anyone speaks up in the next 2 seconds, I will move on and let Greg get on to his board meeting. And we will definitely be in touch because there's so much cross information that we need to work on to not reinvent the wheel, but to build off what is already being done. So thank you very much.
And thank you, everybody.
Okay, bye. So Tanya, I guess we will move to my presentation, which is getting down to the nuts and bolts of how are we trying to fill a gap that was identified from the presentation or from the report that Michael started off with, the Blue Economy Knowledge Product. So Tanya, if you could put up my slides, which are now nowhere near as pretty as everyone else's, but never mind. So I will actually go into a bit more description about the Blue Impact initiative, where we are trying to work towards filling a gap that has been identified and is quite a challenge, but we will explain the issues as we go along. Next slide, please. Next slide. So as we've seen, it's very important to create a pipeline. One of the big issues that comes up in the discussion of blue economy and investors in general is looking for pipeline, eligible pipeline. And we can't all do it by ourselves. We have to work with local partners. Okay, and this is where UNDP, Global Fund for Coral Reefs, Blue Finance, each sector has different partners that we work very closely with to identify blue U for fishing. We work with them. They bring us projects and say, hey, what do you have? How can you help us? We have helped them develop their sustainability. We have helped them develop their bankability, their investability. But or actually, the local partner works more to develop the business, and then they say, where do we go from here? And that is where we step in and we look to see, are they eligible? Are they working on a sustainability factor? As Greg was talking about, what is their cash flow? What is their basic financial situation? Do they have financial discipline? What is their bankability status? How do we make them more bankable? And once we get sort of the financial situation stabilized and the sustainability issues identified, we work with them through a group of experts to be it ourselves up to a certain point. And then if there's something more technical, we'll bring in experts because we are not experts in everything to help them fill the gap where we see a problem. Not a problem or an area that needs to be worked on, because one of the issues here is we're talking scale. And as soon as you take an operation and try and scale it, in order to scale impact, we need to scale operations. And very often that is where the problems arise. Organizations are not often structured to scale up. So we have to be very, very conscious of that, and also not to scale too fast, which I think has been referred to as killing the goose. So we have identified, do they fit the criteria? And one of the key criteria here, our definition, as has been mentioned along the way, what is the definition of SME? In this case, and as was identified in the study, was there's a gap between $100,000 and 10 million. Why? Because once a project is up and running, gets through the accelerator and is kicking along, The problem is it needs to scale. And if you're a financer and you have money and you have an option between a 10 million project, a 5 million project, a 20 million project, or 40 million, it's the same amount of work almost to do one or the other. So obviously you go to the one that's easier, where you can make more money. So that is why this gap in the middle, for the reasons Greg mentioned as well, all the lack of collateral knowledge, standards, disciplines, make the less than 10 million often a lot more work than the larger organizations. So that is why we're focusing only on that sector. So, okay, we do the needs assessments, and then we bring in our experts, step 2 for the investment readiness, and we do the improve with experts to improve the sustainability and bankability. Then once we see that they are essentially financially presentable, not that they're not already financially strong, but not necessarily in the package that the market is expecting. Remember, we are totally market driven. We are bringing market standards down. That is, we always have to keep that in the back of our mind, because we're not going to get somebody ready if there's not somebody ready to take them off or to finance them. So we then have a whole process of investor engagement, which is another skill, actually. You have to be able to do presentations. You have to know who are the right investors for your sector, for your size, for your geography, for the issues that you're dealing with. So it's a whole nother expertise that is focused on. And that, I would have to say, Michael, is very much the key point there. I'm more on the bankability. I have a corporate banking background. So the investor side is a whole nother skill, and that is where the team works on developing their selling skills, their pitching skills, their deals, their decks, and also to help them identify which kind of financing is best for their organization and who can provide it. And so then there's the last part, which is the closing of the deal, stepping in, negotiating, guiding. And it doesn't stop there, because it's an ongoing process. We have to figure out the blended finance needs, the ongoing needs. This is not a one-shot deal. This is long-term, because we're looking for the mission achievement, which is impact. Okay, we're very mission-driven, but within a market discipline, because we do have to bring private capital in order to make impact really happen and reach the SDGs. So the eligibility, the first ones we've already talked about, the bankability, the sustainability, and these are just some detailed questions. What level are they at? They have to be technically ready, commercially viable. And this is where we work very closely with the accelerators. So you very often, you heard the presentation about the accelerators. It sounds like we're doing the same things. We're doing the same things intellectually, but at slightly different stages. So it requires working hand in hand with accelerators as well. And each one, each market, each industry, each sector has different factors. Next phase, next slide, please. So these are just some examples. And one of the things that's important and was noted, that we have the actual projects of aquaculture, for example. But with that now, and more, you need the data, you need the technology. And this is where the innovations are coming through the accelerators. And it's very interesting, because you have to get the data to begin with, gather it, and then be able to analyze it. Because what do you need? We have financial data, that's what financial reports are for. But what we don't often have are the sustainability metrics. And that is why companies like Mari Oceans is the actual growing. Sea Green is the technology side. Waste management, we have other companies that are working on technology identification. How do you track waste management? So the two have to go very much hand in hand, the traditional on-the-ground activity, as well as the technology developments for measuring, improving, making things more efficient. Next slide, please. So we have, what do we have? You have a knowledge center because there's an enabling environment, whether it's for the SMEs themselves. We've heard that banks, and we heard this in another webinar, that the financial institutions themselves are saying, help us become enabled. We have to learn, we have to understand. So whatever the subject is, the financial advisor, we've talked about how we help them identify their financial soft spots and then help them structure appropriately and then train and keep the mentorship going. This is not one shop deal. Next slide, please. So these are just some sectors that were done in the Blue Economy Knowledge Product that show this. I mean, this was done a few years ago, and obviously you have more up-to-date information. What is the situation of the SME finance in Fiji? And so we defer to you on whether what has been updated or not, but there are different sources of financing, microfinance, crowdfunding, private capital. But when you get above the 100,000 or 50,000, sometimes you have to move to banks. And what are the other issues related to capital funding for foreigners? Because local markets can't handle everything. So you have to make yourself attractive to the other organizations. Next slide, please. So as we mentioned, we're dealing with some issues that make life a little more complicated. We are dealing with emerging markets. We're dealing with impact investing. We're dealing specifically with the blue economy and ticket sizes, meaning financings less than $10 million. And so that is a very, very, that is our sweet spot, but it's a very specific need, which covers so much of the need of the region, in particular Fiji. And I was at the UN Ocean Conference in Lisbon, and what was very interesting is the concept of what is your actual country size, what defines a country, and the fact that the ocean space is now being considered part of the economic area is a very important factor, especially for ocean-based or large island states. And so the investor, we screen the investors to make sure they're focused on that area, because many are not. And then we find them through their impact funds, family offices, wealth managers, foundations. They're very different, but they're a very select group within the larger impact financing space. And that is where the more we do across the region in this area, the more we can identify who are the players, and we can all save time and be more efficient. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So basically, we and other players are a channel for private investment into the Fijian blue economy, and dependent very much on revenue-based probably financing for the local entities, because it is such an important part, but we can't do it alone. The partnership with UNDP has been essential in developing contacts, identifying what are the national priorities, and then we just pick off where the local people need extra help. We step in, and for this, Vanille is listed as the contact person locally, but obviously there's a very large team, Tanyu in the regional office, and then we're available from Europe. But our charter is definitely Southeast Asia. So we have the pipelines, we have the readiness, and then we have the investors. So we complement whatever you're doing locally. We're not trying to preach anything. We're trying to complement the activity and fit your needs where you see them best. I hope that was not too confusing, and I'm open to questions, or if you want to move directly to general questions, that is fine too. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Joanne. So checking again, if there are any specific questions on Joanne's presentation. Okay, so perhaps we should move to the next segment then and take all the questions and discussion together.
Anything in the chat?
Not specifically, no.
Okay.
I think Marita, are you?
To go ahead with the presentation, Tiano?
Yes, please. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Good evening, everybody. And I've just realized that I'm very dark here, so I might just put on my lights behind me. Thank you so much for the invitation for Leanne and I to join you and to speak. We'll be very much sharing SME perspective on all of this. And I'll just start presenting my slides. I'll also try not to repeat lots of what has already been said and jump straight to kind of, sharing some challenges that I hope speak to some of the constraints and the opportunities that have been raised previously. So my name's Marita, and I'm very much sharing my personal views as a small tourism operator. We run a hiking company called Talon Treks. And as that, we're members of the Dorvata Sustainable Tourism Collective, which is a network of SMEs in the tourism space, all working on sustainable tourism. And I also, from the consulting business that we run, also are involved in several small business accelerator programs. Leanne will explain and introduce who she is and what she does. An incredible sailor who has much more experience on the ocean than probably everybody on the call put together. And I'll let her explain that when we come on to the business opportunity that we're seeking to bring to market, and are very grateful recipients of the Blue Accelerator grant scheme as part of seed capital to make that happen. Much of what I have on this first slide has already been said. I want to put some reality around the comments of banks being risk averse in Fiji. They're not just risk averse, they are not wanting to touch risk at all. Just as a very practical example, to get a company credit card for our small business in Fiji took us 6 months of paperwork and required us to put a security deposit of $10,000 into another bank account, which was the credit limit of our credit card. So not really credit at all. And that just gives you hopefully a bit of a reality when we talk about banks not being willing to loan. We're talking about fairly extreme aversion to risk being one of kind of the barriers of accessing finance in that gap that's been talked about, between the kind of 100,000 and 1 million kind of space. From our perspective, where we sit as small, the only finance we've ever managed to raise as a loan has been through credit corporations, not from the commercial banks. So most SMEs in the country struggle to access just good banking and e-commerce services, let alone any kind of innovative finance solutions. So if you talk to most players who are trying to scale, most businesses in Fiji can't even take online payments for their services because none of the existing off-the-shelf payment solutions work in the Fiji context. And finding out the barriers to what the constraint is in that space is a whole different ballgame, which we don't need to go into tonight. But that's just to kind of place some context on all of the conversations around impact investment, equity investment, accelerator grants, very much beyond the reach of most SMEs. And so working through intermediaries, as many people have already discussed, and with value chain partners, so larger businesses who might be in a position to raise finance, who are then working with smaller entities, is absolutely critical for most SMEs in the country. So what are SMEs doing kind of in the blue economy space? Well, they're doing lots of things. And as has been mentioned earlier, which I won't restate, an SME in Fiji is anything below 1.25 million turnover. So you're considered a large company if you have turnover of above 1.25 million, which Fijian dollars, which is obviously not necessarily the definition elsewhere in the world, and which plays into kind of some of the solutions in terms of getting SMEs the capital they need to scale, and the technical expertise that they need to scale. But there are lots of people doing some incredible work. I won't go through all of these examples, but Traceable Solutions is a local company that's providing traceability solutions to the fisheries sector. We have aquaculture examples that are bringing to scale solutions for supplying retail and tourism. We have jewelry makers, very large businesses like Viva Pearls and Adorn Pacific have a partnership together, but obviously J Hunter Pearls is the kind of the leader kind of on the scale side. We have skincare producers, the fertilizer company which mentioned, and we have a lot in the tourism sector because it's a core part of our economy, and therefore many tourism operators have marine conservation agreements or have agreements with communities relating to activities that support smaller enterprises within the tourism sector. And because we come from a tourism background, we're going to speak largely to the tourism opportunity, noting what Greg was discussing about needing to have an external market. Well, that external market for tourism operators is the tourism sector, in a similar way to if you've got a product and you need an export market in order to scale, the tourism sector actually is an export market and can provide that gap for or that market opportunity for smaller businesses. So obviously Fiji's largest tourism revenue earner, securing earnings from tourism can support sustainable financing for ocean-related initiatives, and we'll be talking about the development of Fiji's Ocean Trail, which is what we're working on currently. It can also provide not just a service-related opportunity for the businesses that are tourism operators directly, but it's also, as we saw during COVID, a very critical market for many products and services that are not tourism facing, but which rely on the tourism sector for their market. And that includes cosmetics, it includes seafood, it includes transport providers. One of the things that I wanted, to kind of encourage everybody to do is to actually learn from the existing experiences in this space. And I just wanted to share a few barriers that relate to those. So there are some really good examples of businesses that have scaled successfully, that do attract that have attracted finance and equity investments, and that do attract relative or do have relatively large revenue portfolios. People like Naya, which is a dive liveaboard, Rivers Fiji, which is a rafting company, the Vatuira Seascape is and Namena Seascape are partnerships, they're trusts in partnership with dive operators. Rise Beyond the Reef is a small organization that has successfully provided artisan opportunities for many small community-based artists. And so there are many examples within the Fijian economy of businesses that have scaled, and learning from those companies is critical because scaling in Fiji is dependent on the critical elements of the Fijian market. So, how did you access finance, or which insurance products did you look for when you were trying to comply with tourism compliance offerings, or whatever the question might be? Often these answers can only be answered really by examining case studies from within the country. The other issue within tourism is that insurance products are widely used, so they're understood, and so where there are opportunities that relate to new insurance products, the tourism market is a kind of key entry point from that perspective. Some of the barriers that we see on a daily basis are policy and investment coherence issues. So while we have fantastic policies that relate to the oceans, that relate to climate change, we've got very strong legislation, in some of these areas, we do face on a regular basis issues that not all government departments and all regulatory agencies are on the same page when it comes to facilitating opportunities in the sector. And this might be, for example, things like regulatory agencies that are involved in maritime transport, or regulatory agencies that are involved in leasing land, not necessarily understanding the potential synergies between conservation opportunities, marine protection opportunities, and business opportunities, and often having a very blinkered and black and white approach to regulating business as a single kind of homogeneous entity. So another thing that I think is really important is, as previous speakers have mentioned, the private sector is not a homogeneous being, and therefore one size does not fit all when it comes to regulating the private sector. The procurement policies of major players in the sector, particularly in tourism, have the potential to shift the dial to provide greater opportunities to SMEs. So when we talk about finance and we talk about some of the barriers in that space, actually even just changing the procurement policies of some of the larger players in this space, which our pension fund has a lot of control over, because the pension fund owns 7 of the hotels in the country, has a major shifting the dial in that space could have a major knock-on effect to opportunities for SMEs. And technical assistance by larger players and larger businesses in the space is also really critical in providing that advice and support to small businesses. We often get a lot of external advice and expertise from businesses elsewhere in the country, but actually, unless you've run a business in Fiji, it's very difficult to fully understand some of the barriers that a small entity might face and why it might take, for example, 2 years to get your e-commerce platform up and running. The bigger entities know the space, but there are very few examples of kind of larger businesses playing that mentoring role to smaller businesses, apart from within kind of industry associations and business networks. So private sector intermediaries, and Matanataki was mentioned earlier, which is a good example. Private sector intermediaries are absolutely critical in that space, in supporting awareness for their members, in identifying opportunities for bundling, in identifying pipelines, in identifying investment opportunities. And within that space, in terms of looking at opportunities, there are major barriers to connecting with marginalized communities, which is why it's important to look at the businesses that are out there that are doing that. So businesses that are engaging community-based enterprises in their value chains and learning from them and understanding what they need to kind of provide support to make that happen. So I think I've already said all this. So SMEs have lots of these close relationships, which make them really important partners, because they understand the context, they understand the issues that coastal communities might be facing, they understand the local government agencies that are involved in the space, they understand the opportunities and resources that exist locally, but financing institutions, as we've heard, are not interested in dealing with SMEs directly. And to be honest, SMEs can't be expected to understand all of the language of finance, structuring investment and equity options, developing pipelines. It's a whole other kind of world to most of us. And you're certainly not going to find, I often, joke with government colleagues who say it's really difficult to engage the private sector. We invite them to all our workshops. It's just like, which SME in Fiji is going to have time to attend a 3-day workshop? None. So perhaps look at an alternative way of engaging with the private sector, because that isn't going to work as an opportunity to build their awareness of this space. I've listed some intermediaries and accelerators there. Many of you have already mentioned the importance of kind of working through those. So I won't labor the points, and I will hand over to my dear friend and colleague Leanne, who's going to talk about a really exciting initiative that we're just in the process of developing, and which we've received support from the Blue Accelerator grant scheme for. So over to you, Leanne.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Marita. Yeah, so the Utunialo, which means heart of spirit, is a 72-foot sailing vessel. And she's done about maybe more than 35,000 nautical miles, sailed to Hawaii, and up to the States and back down to the Pacific. So she's got quite a few miles under her. So, and now we've been given the opportunity to start this ocean trail in Fiji, and to provide a, sustainable tourism opportunity for us. So the Utunialo has always or have been dependent on grants, but this BAGS initiative gives us the opportunity to start a project, and for us to be able to be sustainable on our own. So, by doing this, we will have the domestic and international visitors that'll be able to sail to the Asawas, and we're planning on working in partnership with a marine conservation trust, and that works with manta rays and coral planting and renewing coral reefs. So that would be that this grant has given us that opportunity to do this. So yeah, so we plan to test it next year. And it's also given us the opportunity to provide employment for our volunteers. It's all volunteer based for the last 10 years. And we will be able to provide employment for our volunteers as well. This also aligns with the National Ocean Policy and the SDG 14. So the strategies is realizing and seize emerging ocean opportunities and innovations through development partners, regional and international collaboration of development partners, as well as the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science, including technical, economic, and social dimensions that are aligned to the NDP and other national plans, especially those that employ nature-based solutions. And others promote, support, and expand ocean-related sustainable livelihoods through improved where are we, Marita? Sorry. And number 4.3 is to ensure progress towards increased equitability of ocean benefits across society through an improved understanding and monitoring of benefit flows across society. And encourage public awareness of and access to knowledge on ocean and marine issues, and support investment in youth stewardship initiatives. So the Ocean Trail will enhance knowledge of the threats to our marine environment as part of an immersive and educational itinerary. The itinerary development and operation will ensure that at every stage, communities are engaged in sharing their knowledge, their traditional knowledge, and supported to identify management practices that enhance marine conservation. The trail will formalize and enhance relationships into long-term and ongoing partnerships between all involved. So we'll also leverage additional private sector support, allow progress work to form a commercial arm of Utunialo that would otherwise have taken years to realize, if at all. Private sector partners in the Asawas ready to engage, but Utunialo previously lacked resources to scope and test feasible routes. Genuinely engaging communities as full partners in a culturally appropriate way requires time and resources. Partnerships with marinas and hotel operators can support training in drill construction and outreach to communities and keep traditional sailing knowledge alive. Partnerships with Tourism Fiji and for-purpose travel agencies to leverage marketing support. This will also help promote community engagement and women's leadership. Uchinialo has an experience in creating opportunities for marginalized communities and supporting them to keep traditional knowledge of sustainable sailing options alive. And Pacific women acknowledged as some of the most talented marine engineers in weaving sails. And the Uchinialo has always supported women to assume leadership roles. Yeah, so. We hope you'll be able to come and join us in 2024, and you know, we'll teach traditional sailing and talk about the culture, and also connect with the communities that we visit, and also protecting our marine environment, you know, as we go along. Yeah, and support conservation of vital knowledge, and you'll get to meet us incredible crew from across, you know, all of Fiji. We have volunteers from across the country, so yeah, which are very passionate about protecting the ocean. So thank you.
Thanks, Leanne. And yeah, this is so we're talking about raising money for, you know, blue economy. So you can put your names down now if you like for our 2023 sale as part of our testing routes. So let us know if you're keen to come and be part of those first adventures. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Marita and Leanne. Sorry. That was really helpful, very concrete, and almost, yeah, and very evocative in terms of the possibilities. I think now we can move to discussion and closing. Unfortunately, a number of colleagues, including from government, had to leave for a variety of commitments, but we hope to follow up. So I think there's been a lot of food for thought. So let's just see if even amongst the group here, there are some ideas that particularly strike you, some thoughts that we could consider before we get to closing remarks.
May I jump in and ask a question? I'm having trouble finding my little hand, so to raise my hand.
No worries.
I think what Marita and Leanne have mentioned is classic of a lot of SMEs, grant-based. That's the impact side, is very much grant-based. And so the key is to come up with revenue-based financing. The actual local market situation on e-commerce, internet, very often it's a question of internet signal or electricity stability and things like that to access e-banking. But I'm also a professor of business, and what you're talking about is so classic, that the people who have developed the business know the product really, really well, the product. But investors are looking at organizations. And so the discipline of the organization, and the key is to make it as simple as possible. So it's not a burden for the local organization to apply some of what would be called the market discipline, how to prepare the financial statements, what are the sustainability expectations, the metrics, and that is the real challenge. And of course, the smaller the organization, the people are very focused on the product and are not going to want to waste their time on what would be considered administrative matters, because you're busy running the product, which is your selling or the building or whatever, accessing supplies. So it's classic whether you go from $10,000 up to 10 million, very often, and this is a big issue also for startups and new technology, they are very much on the product. And nobody is talking about the skills that are needed to make the organization function and, of course, then grow. So these are very, very important points to match the two worlds of finance and the business, just from a theoretical point of view. And then the points you mentioned about the actual local issues are super important, and only the people on the ground can identify what those key issues are. And that's why the partnerships are so important to work together. So that's all.
Thanks, Joanne. I see Dominique's hand up.
Thank you. That was a comment directed at Marita and Leanne. I was quite interested about what you said about the local banks. The difficult two things actually: the capacity of local banks to provide finance and to deal with small and medium enterprises. The difficulty in that, and that's just very basic stuff. And it is really what the ease of doing business is about. It's all those practical issues of SMEs. The other one that I thought was interesting in your presentation is the fact that not all government ministries are on the same page. And that's a really difficult one, because you might have an oceans policy, for example, in the case of Fiji. And I think it's run through the Ministry of Economy, but is there a mechanism actually to implement that oceans policy across ministries so that there is some understanding about the common objectives that the government is trying to get to, and what does that mean for their own operations as regulators, or in the case of local banks as lenders, for example. And this is it sounds like it's nuts and bolts, but it's actually quite important, and it's part of the enabling environment. And that let alone moving to attracting capital to scale up and all that, which is a bigger issue again. Thank you.
Yeah, totally agree, Dominique. And just to share some, I mean, it doesn't relate to the ocean space necessarily, but I think it speaks to that issue. They won't mind me sharing this, but one of our members is a small chocolate producer in Savu Savu, and they had an experience during COVID. So bear in mind, this is at the height of the pandemic, when they had to stop accepting visitors that visit their small chocolate factory, and were totally reliant on chocolate sales as their only source of revenue. They had waited 6 months for a health inspector to come and visit the premises to renew their health license. The health inspector had cancelled 3 times, arrived 2 weeks after their health license had expired, and shut them down. And that's just an example which unfortunately is way too common when it comes to the front-facing regulatory agencies. So one of the big challenges in that space is connecting the national level policy and the significant political will and leadership that exists in that space to the regulatory agencies seeing themselves as facilitators of opportunities and of business, kind of on a day-to-day basis. So I'll stop there. I can see Benil's got his hand up as well.
Thanks, Marita. Colleagues, I was just wanting to reaffirm, the point about, access to financing from local banks and institutions. I think that has been an Achilles heel, at least for scaling up the MSME space here in Fiji. Speaking from my experience back in government and also now moving to UNDP, it has always been a challenge for MSMEs to be able to access realistic, affordable, and predictable finance. So I think it's extremely important that we create a dedicated sort of lending facility, at least for MSMEs in the blue economy space. And I think that's one of the key things that Izhar was actually trying his best to explain, that we want to be able to create a blue investment fund or blue investment facility. Basically, the facility would be capitalized by the blue bonds, And what would happen is then the banks could borrow from this facility at 0.25%, for example, and on lend to their customers could be, someone like Utonialo, could be Telenor Trax or someone else at a maximum rate of say 3.99%, which is below the market interest rate. So it's actually cheaper, much more affordable lending. So the whole idea is to be able to instigate banks to do that. And so we're hoping that the blue bonds and other mechanisms the UNDP is working on with the Fijian government can really be the catalyst. And at the same time, as Radhika has mentioned as well, that and you all, that digital solutions are definitely something that we need to be adopting very, very rapidly. I think it helps to leapfrog some of the challenges that we have really stated. Particularly in terms of marketing products, connecting with rural communities to leverage their economic potential, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a lot of opportunities here, and very eager to explore this through the Blue Silta Grant Scheme, Marita and Lian, and many other initiatives that we hope to really pilot in the near future. Of course, with the good help and guidance from our Bangkok colleagues, Radhika and TNU and others. Thank you.
So just a quick question. There was the suggestion for sustainable procurement, and that seemed like something really perhaps not so difficult to do, with a little bit of effort, which could be quite important. It's something that I'm quite passionate about, that we don't use our own market power to do things that we're talking about to drive this kind of change. So what are the challenges there? Is it just something that hasn't come up, or are there particular issues that need to be addressed?
I mean, maybe from my if I can kick off from my perspective, I'd actually really like a conversation with UNDP about this, because it's as much an issue for UNDP as it is for many other agencies. FMPF, I don't know the investment team at FMPF personally, and Vinil would probably be able to tell you more about that space. But I agree that it would certainly seem a low-hanging fruit when it comes to catalyzing investments that are required. So for example, most of the hotels upon reopening went through a basic refit to, well, some more than basic, but a refit to get them reopened. In none of the tender specifications that I saw anyway, was there any mention of, the types of technology that would be used, solar energy, waste, water, etc. Whereas that could have obviously been a key part of that. And the way that most hotel investment is structured, as I understand it, I'm not an expert in this space, but the management contractor will have an agreement with FMPF, who owns the facility, to have to refurbish it every certain number of years. So it could be easily, I say easily because nothing's ever easy, right? It sounds easy to say, but easily built into those kind of agreements, such that it's in line with the provisions of the Climate Change Act. The Climate Change Act will give us a space to push that. There's a lot of detail in there around obligations that will be placed on FMPF and others. So again, Vinil knows much more about that than I do, but those conversations I'm sure are happening as part of the Climate Change Act implementation process. And then with development partners, which are a major procurer also, not just UNDP, but development partners in general. I was actually very enthused this morning when I saw an email from some UNDP colleagues asking me for recommendations of smaller sustainable tourism operators that they could use for their annual retreats at the end of the year. So those things are unfortunately at the moment a bit of an exception, because the same issues that relate to SME finance are also the same issues that your average procurement officer within a hotel or within a development agency faces. They want an easy invoice where everything's included. They don't have to worry about, dealing with 5 different providers for catering and logistics and whatever. They want one entity that they can deal with, that knows what they're doing, that can send them an invoice quickly. And so the same kind of awareness about the potential of social procurement and the potential that it has to provide opportunities, I think is relevant for procurement agencies as much as it is for commercial banks, say.
But what about aggregation on the side of SMEs? I mean, so perhaps dealing with both sides. if there could be, collaboratives, collectives that bring these solutions together from the side of SMEs, it would also perhaps, be an easier for procurement agencies not to deal with, as you say, multiple SMEs.
Totally agree, but I'll give you a practical example. So the Dorvata Sustainable Tourism Collective is exactly that, is an aggregator, but there is no, it's very difficult to generate the business case without kind of the equivalent support on the other side for it to make it work. For example, for us, we could be an aggregator to provide tailored itineraries within Fiji. So we operate the Intrepid itinerary, for example, which is an adventure travel company based out of Australia. There would be potentially other ways that we could aggregate all of our members to be providing those kind of sustainable tourism itineraries. But realizing markets, particularly in the tourism space, has a long lead-in time. So you're talking about, 1 to 2 years potentially before you can generate concrete partnerships. And no SMEs that are part of our collective have the resourcing to take time away from their individual business to say, okay, I'm going to spend hours and hours and hours trying to realize these opportunities that would help, our membership as a collective. So coming out of COVID, particularly, we did a lot of that during COVID. And to be perfectly honest, at the moment, we're all like, okay, can I stop helping everybody else for the moment and just focus on my business again? Because the SMEs that survived the last 2 years in tourism did that by doing everything they possibly could to survive. So, people have given of themselves a huge amount in the last 2 years. So whereas those business opportunities exist, I think, the support that's out there from agencies and aggregators and accelerators that make you feel like you're not alone. And I know that sounds trivial, but it is actually super important at the moment. From a personal perspective, we very almost just shut up shop. And if it wasn't for Intrepid, if it wasn't for having a partner, who shared the same values as us overseas, saying, we want to be putting your dates in the calendar for 2022 and 2023 a year ago, we probably would have walked away. So I think that kind of, I think somebody mentioned it earlier, it's not just the finance that's necessary for scaling, it's the technical support, it's the relationships, and relationships are so important in the Pacific. So, having people in the agencies, in the accelerators, in the space who understand and can listen, which is why I just gave a shout out to Vanille, because it really matters that the people that are on the other side understand the context, because half of the time that Leanne and I spend on calls is helping to educate others. And quite frankly, as small SMEs, we just don't have the time to do that. So jumping on a call with somebody that we know we don't have to educate, we don't have to explain exactly what happens when you go to a bank and you stand in line to a teller or whatever that might look like, is actually hugely important for that enabling environment and the supporting services.
Thanks, Marita. So I think, are there any other thoughts from Joanne? You put quite a lot of, Joanne and Dominique put quite a lot of thoughtful comments also and suggestions in the chat, but over to you.
I just have a comment, and that is that the issues you're facing with the banks is exactly the same issues for investors, because it takes the same amount of time to lend to a big company as it does to lend to a very small operation, which may even be riskier, and they're going to earn 5% of what they could have earned. They are a business. That is their business. They are not a social service. So they have to look how the best they're going to use their resources. So the question then comes down, who are the financial institutions who are their business vision and mission is actually to help that sector. And then same thing we find with the investors and the investment side, If they make a 10 million deal or a 100 million deal, it's the same amount of work, or a $1 million deal. So it's a question of finding the right players who want to be in that space. And it's, you start getting a little bit more mission driven and less pure financial driven. And that is where we're all trying to float in that same space and different ends of it to find who are the better players and the better markets. And it's a challenge on all sides. That's all.
What's been interesting, Joan, I completely agree with everything you and Dominique have just said. What's been interesting for us is that kind of the conversations that we've had with so-called impact investors have been no different from the commercial banks. So you think you're dealing with an entity, you know, potentially which is willing to accept a lower rate of financial return or less paperwork, and they're just as bad. And I'm like, why am I talking to you? I could just be trying to bang Westpac and ANZ's head together a little bit more.
That's what Michael's job is all about.
Yeah, that wrong. Yeah, this is definitely the wrong assumptions. You know, impact investors want their return, but they also want some sustainability outcomes as well. So there you go.
But there's a spectrum of investors. There's a spectrum of investors.
Yeah, there are.
It's your space.
Just as well.
I think you know, just building on that point as well from experience with operationalizing the investing in coral reef and blue economy project that Gregor was mentioning about. I think it's also important to, because there's a broad spectrum of types of investors and impact investors and so on and so forth. So we really need to be able to find out which ones fit the purpose and fit the buck for the Fijian context or the Pacific context. Because we've been speaking to, I won't name names, but we've been speaking to a particular investor, pretty much, you know, linked with a very prominent multilaterals and MDVs, who we're working with, but they expect an IRR or internal rate of return of upwards of between 10 to 15%, which is basically ridiculous for the Pacific. And especially for projects that are, you know, starting from scratch, that are, you know, in a stage where they would need a certain level of patient capital, patient incubation. So you can't expect outright, you know, that levels of internal rate of returns or returns just out of the gate. So there's a need for patient capital and patient investment. And I think that while we can say that there's a lot of impact investors and a lot of, you know, venture capitalists and angel investors out there, there's a far smaller and a very niche group that would fit the purpose for the Pacific context. And that's where the trick will be for us to be able to find them and be matching them with these projects that really are very impactful and has huge transformative potential, but just is not being able to be matched with the right type of investors. At least in my opinion, I stand to be corrected. Thank you.
I wouldn't correct you at all. That's spot on. All the comments are. I just wanted to say that a couple of things make those kinds of investments happen. One is local participation. Many impact investors invest through, they basically lend to local MFIs, local, you know, banks and credit co-ops. So they want to see that on the ground participation first, and then it's easier for them because they're not going to do the due diligence so much on the SMEs. So that's an important point to remember, that the local financial participation in whatever form, it doesn't even have to be necessarily capital, it can be just a technical support or perhaps a credit line in certain cases. The other point is that maybe the investor that you're referring to had a private equity fund or a fund, you know, structure that has generally, you know, an 8-year with a 2-year possible extension time horizon on it, and 2 investment holding periods of an average of 4 years, preferably 3, and they want to hit that 15% return in those 3 to 4 years. So they're all out looking for the big unicorn, and it's just not appropriate for most developing countries and ones like Fiji. So if we can aggregate more of these projects together so that they have an appeal towards other investors, the family offices and even other larger impact investors that are not within that commercial structure of you know, a 4-year holding period, then we get somewhere. And the 3 that Minister Isar Ali mentioned those three sectors of blue shipping and sustainable seafood and sustainable waste management are really good ones for aggregating projects into portfolios across islands, not just Fiji, so across the region. And that's of keen interest to the investors. Then you get to some scale where you're crossing $20–30 million total. And it's far easier to sell, to raise $20 or $30 million than it is to raise 2 or 3. So those are some points to take home that we can follow up with you all on.
These just a couple of points on the issue of scale. Is there any interest in looking at a Pacific-wide sort of type, or at least say a couple of islands working together on a specific investment sort of portfolio? I think the shipping one might have been one of those where there was more than one country engaged to actually get over that issue of scale, because the scale of investment and the scale of projects are not necessarily matching.
Yeah, I had the same exchange with some of the colleagues actually in the chat directly, and that seems like a clear one, because for example, some people don't even know where to go, to go into the issue of blue or green shipping and the solutions that Fiji is looking at. And it just occurred to me that, the SIDS would be in the large Pacific Island state, Fiji, could be in a much better position if there was that kind of collaboration across the different SIDS. With the UNDP economists, we've also been thinking whether it makes sense to think about different types of aggregation, or even having a platform, to share some of these solutions, aggregate demand, so that you could collectively face investors much better. And so I think this is right up your alley, right, Joanne and Michael, this notion of somehow aggregating demand at different levels and sort of engaging, trying to get at the issue of scale and
and working with the aggregators
on both sides. Of the issue.
Working with the aggregators that are already out there. In the shipping case, it's the Pacific Blue Shipping Partnership. Have they hit $50 million? That was their initial target. But that's across a dozen Pacific Island states. And there are other aggregators out there as well. So we work with them, as well as looking at some finance facilities under the Blue Impact Initiative ourselves. But yes, that's because you have to get out of the trap of, it's not that people are impatient, it's that their structures have a certain impatience built in, or a limited time horizon. It's not appropriate for many of these businesses. The other one is partnering with their customers, the industries, both on the offtake and supply chains, to get financing through them, trade finance, and so forth. That's another area where you can get certain scale. We're working with some of our partners in the seaweed area, for instance, on relationships with large corporate buyers here in Europe. So there are lots of ways to approach it, and you have to try all of them. I think the other one is COPSI and PEMSI in the region that are worth looking at for each of these areas.
Well, they don't include Pacific countries, though. They're just ASEAN countries.
So I think we could go on for a long time, but I'm starting to see Leanne and Marita need to leave, and others, and I think we all have commitments. But I think it's been really rich, and thanks to the colleagues who come in on a number of these different ones, Dominique, in particular, Joanne, Michael, and I think each conversation gets richer and richer. And I think we need to go back and then just look at some of the very concrete suggestions that came up. And I agree with Vanille. I mean, I think we're getting much more of a handle of how we can be very practical in the support, whether it's technical or just connecting actors, dots, dealing with some of the low-hanging fruit in the ecosystem issues. And I think we just need to take that forward. and perhaps do more connecting of dots across the countries that we're looking at as well. I mean, I hear from colleagues that some of that has been going on informally, but perhaps looking at this more. Michael, do share stuff around the Pacific Blue Shipping Partnership. Vanil, is this something that Fiji is part of?
Yes, we definitely are. We're co-chairing this. Well, the Fijian government is co-chairing this with the Republic of Marshall Islands, but it has
That's
slowed
right.
down because of COVID-19. So there's a lot of challenges, but yeah.
Great. Yeah, so I think it would be helpful to share with some of the other countries as well, including Indonesia. They were the ones sort of asking about that one.
Yeah,
And the Maldives. I think it would be, quite. And we don't know how many other countries, that we're working with who would benefit from that. So I think quite useful.
Yeah.
So
An update would be good. An update on that partnership would be good.
Yeah.
Okay. What I'll do is I'll reach out to my Fijian government colleagues and just see if they can provide me an update on the latest discussions, and I'll put together a 1 or 2 pager and provide that to you. Is that okay?
Yeah, and just even some basic information in terms of what are the cost differences from the regular fleet. Are there leasing arrangements? Just some practical information as well that would just kickstart the discussions.
If I might give like a 30-second quick background on 20-second background. So because the Blue Shipping Partnership was still the Fijian government's brainchild, but the rest of the region has sort of struggled because of their battle with COVID-19, the economic crisis that they had. The whole idea is that the Fijian government proceeds to demonstrate what is possible through the blue bonds. And that's why you'll notice that when Izar was presenting, one of the key flagship investment opportunities was to bring into hybrid electric or fully electric vessels. That is to be able to demonstrate what is possible regionally, because Fiji is ready to go, but other countries in the partnership are at different levels of maturity financially and fiscally. So that's one of the reasons why the Fijian government is taking the first step through the blue bonds to demonstrate what's possible and then be able to hopefully replicate this. But that's in a nutshell, but I can provide further updates for sure on this.
Thank you.
Great. Like I said, we are happy to really continue and deepen this engagement to be more catalytic, combining efforts at the regional, country, and multi-country level. So again, thanks very much to everyone for their time. Let me turn to Tian Yu on next steps.
Thanks, Radhika. I think it's no from my side, and also considering we have limited colleagues, I think we save some information, relevant information, and perhaps just by email for the next steps. Yeah. Okay,
great. So thank you all, and particularly colleagues in Fiji. It's much later than it is here for us. And you're probably itching to go home. So thank you again. And thanks to Michael, Joanne, Dominique, Leland, Tian Yu, and our colleague Artak. Some of you know, he leads the work on private sector, coming in on blended finance, bonds, all kinds of things. And we will have, if I haven't mentioned this earlier, an expanded team at the regional level as well. So thanks, Artak, for staying tuned. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you,
Thanks
everyone.
to everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks all.